Welcome back to the latest presentation in the Movement Professional Collaborative Mentorship. So we're going to start getting a little bit more dynamic with these presentations now. We've talked about the movement continuum as a system and how we look at diagnosing or assessing any movement. So the first movement we'll talk about today, which I think is foundational to any movement assessment process, is walking or gait. And we're going to talk about this from a movement continuum approach. So just as a reminder to how we look at things through the movement continuum is we're looking to break every task down into static positions or like the snapshot of any movement. And then we'll understand dynamic transitions and how we can move from one position to the next. And then the ultimate goal is to train what we can control today too. So we have to assess different markers of control. And the 4 markers of control we look at: is there any pain with movement, postural control, which we did a whole presentation on, breath control, and we'll talk about how breath ties into how we can look at where we are in the gait cycle, and then ultimately impact control, which is important here with how our feet are landing on the ground, and that's going to be something we talk about and look at and have drills for. All right, and then ultimately we're using this approach to go into any movement. Today we'll just do that with walking. So when we look at walking, the broadest view is, if we look at the research, is if we walk more efficiently, more speed, more endurance, have more independence, which means we don't need as many pieces of support, such as a cane or a walker and things like that, then you tend to live longer and people do better, and it really does correlate to a longer, more high quality life. In the short view though, is we have to appreciate, how do we get there, right? Because if we just tell people to walk faster and they're not ready to do that, that could be unsafe, and usually they're not going to be able to follow our instruction because there's something that might be missing from their gait cycle. So ultimately we have to slow it down a little bit, and that'll give us an idea of where people are limited and what they need to work on, and then we can add speed back into that when they're a little bit more efficient. But from a training perspective, it's always better to be having some type of walking practice. Even if you don't feel like you can walk well, even if there's some pain that you're working around, is trying to figure out like what somebody's ready for in a walking practice. So it can be very useful, but then to actually show someone that there's a lot we can break down with the gait cycle and make it more efficient, make you a little bit faster with it, have you understand how balance is connected, can be one of the most useful tools you have as a movement professional. So generally when, in physical therapy school, I learned gait as 8 traditional phases. Today we're just gonna break that down into 3, but the initial phases that I remember learning was there was initial contact when your foot landed, there was a certain loading response, mid stance, terminal stance, pre-swing, initial swing, mid-swing, late swing. All of that can be a little bit complex. So to make this easier and to kind of keep it in the idea of understanding positions and transitions, we're going to break it down into 3 positions today. So one is going to be stance, one will be heel strike, and one will be rollover. And the value of these positions is we have one position, stance, which is basically just my leg that I'm standing on is right under my center of gravity. So I'm standing in a way where ideally I have my head over my shoulders or my hip is right over my ankle. So that's going to be a standard that we have here, and then the other leg, or the swing leg, will be in a position where basically it's in line with that stance leg. All right, so the value here is we understand that we have one position where we have 100% of the weight on one leg. That leg is stacked, as we'll call it, and then the heel strike position is just going to be the swing leg is out in front of the center of gravity now. But we really don't change much about this stance leg, and then the rollover position will be the foot is behind the center of gravity. So that's why we just choose these 3 positions, because we have one where we're completely stacked over one leg, this leg is traveling forward, then we're going to have that leg come in front of the center of gravity, but nothing really changes on this stance leg. And then as we move forward through space, the opposite leg now will be in this rollover position where we've shifted our pillar of support. So we're now on the stance leg, or we are bearing weight on the other leg, and we've rolled over. So now our center of gravity is in front of the swing leg. So that's those 3 positions to really understand them, and then we're going to add some arm movement to create a little bit of reciprocity with that. Those are going to be basically what we break down, we understand them, and it really helps our clients understand where they're limited and simplifies the process for them. So the common positional threads that we see with all of these is that there's always going to be this one stacked leg as much as possible. And from an assessment process, you'll be able to see that that's not really easy for people to attain. So then we can start to think of how do we make it easier for someone to maybe get more of a sense of their center of gravity being over their body. And it can also give us some information to say, all right, I got to assess maybe some hip range of motion, some spinal range of motion to see like why is someone having such a difficult time stacking their weight over one side. So it gives us this sort of quick and dirty assessment of saying, okay, I want somebody to be stacked over a leg, to be able to balance over a leg, but if they can't get there, then we know we have some things that we can look at and work on. The other piece of it is that we always have this free swinging leg, and as I talked about, the leg is either going to be in line with the center of gravity, it's going to be in front of the center of gravity, or behind the center of gravity. So those are the three positions that we're looking at, and it sort of dictates our stride length, which I think is really important for people to understand. When we start to slow the gait cycle down, you know, people have different stride lengths, and oftentimes if we want to get somewhere faster, we'll stride out quite far, but then that's going to take us a lot of times out of this position, and it also will affect our impact control of how hard we hit the ground. So by breaking it down into these positions, seeing where can someone feel stacked, where can they feel like they're over their center of gravity, it starts to show them, okay, where can I stride out now without losing my center of gravity or feeling like I'm falling forward. And just by slowing it down and understanding these positions, it sort of dictates what an appropriate stride length is for the individual. We'll just look at, again, the stance position a little bit more, some of the things that are common errors, and some of the things to, be able to assess and, improve on. So ideally, when we're looking at the stance position, it's just like a single leg stance, but how we're doing it is instead of having this free leg be up like a march or behind us, we want to think about keeping the foot in line with the body. And the reason for that is because it's sort of in between moving forward and then coming from behind, like we'll be in the other position. So the assessment here is pretty obvious at first, is how good is the ability to stand on one leg. So you can see that right away, where if somebody just can't be here, then that's where we give somebody a little bit of support. And then I want them to be able to focus on what they're feeling in their feet. So it can be quite useful to have somebody, if they're up for it, to start the practice of the gait process barefoot, so that they can feel where they are in their feet. And ideally, there's a difference between gripping and falling forward into the toes. So we want to feel like we can get this sense of what I like to think of as the four corners of the feet, or the four quadrants of the feet, which we talked about in the postural control presentation. So we have the two corners of the ball of the foot, the inside of the ball of the foot, the outside of the ball of the foot, and then we have two sides of the heel. So we can think about the inside and the outside of the heel. So just as a focus, you might not be able to feel those as distinct points yet, but the concept of having them as distinct points is quite useful, because it makes us think about our foot being wider, and it makes us have a sense of the inside, the outside of the foot, which is going to be really important as we start moving forward with where we're landing a foot in the ground. So right now the idea is four corners of the foot, and it's useful to think of the outer heel and the inner ball of the foot as your two main contact points, because it creates like a diagonal that allows the foot to have some width. So a drill to start would just be get someone in this position with or without support, and then focus on some isometrics where you're focusing on those points of contact in the foot, just showing that the toes aren't gripping. So you can give a cue of you're feeling the outer heel, the inner ball of the foot, spread the toes a little bit, hold for 10 seconds, see how your balance is with or without support, and then change sides. We're also looking at common compensations here would be, other than the toe gripping, would be that the body starts to hinge forward out in front. And this is going to be probably your most common thing that you see. And it will carry over when you travel forward, is that there'll tend to be an overstride where you don't keep your center of gravity over the leg. So we want the head, the shoulders, everything can be pretty much stacked over that bottom leg while we're working on balance and we're working on those foot contacts. So then when we transition into something like a heel strike, this leg that you're standing on is pretty much exactly the same. And now we come down and we tap lightly through the outer heel of the swing leg. And we're shooting here for this outer heel because as we start to travel forward, we're going to want to think about moving generally from the outside of the foot towards the inside of the foot, because as we roll through to move forward, we'll be rolling through that ball of the big toe. So here, the stance position to have people practice would be the same thing we had in the stance position. We're going to have the same leg, but then when we drop the heel down, nothing really changes in this leg. We still have those 4 corners, but now we just have this outer heel contact. And we want to make sure that the heel contact is not too heavy here. We're not trying to put a lot of weight through it. We're still really trying to keep our weight over this back leg and just getting a sense of a light tap and bring it back. So one of the first drills we can do here is outer heel contact, bring it back to stance. Outer heel contact, bring it back to stance. And again, we can do this with or without support early on, with the goal always being that we need a little less support so that we can carry this forward into walking. Okay, so that's simply all it is, trying to shoot for that outer heel, and we can see it as we go towards the outer heel, the hip has to turn out externally, so we get a little bit of hip external rotation. Another focus can be on where we feel we are in the pelvis, so we can have this sense of the right leg is the stance leg here, I'm moving forward, I'm finding that outer heel, but I can keep my hand on the back of my pelvis here just to feel that I'm not dropping forward or I'm not turning too much, that I'm actually staying back a little bit at first and not lunging forward. So it can be useful here as I drop this outer heel down. I'm just going to put my hand on the back of my pelvis here on the left, and I'm just going to take a breath into that area and expand into that area, and then I'll come back, reset, inhale, expand into that area that sort of keeps me back, keeps me more towards external rotation while I'm lightly landing the outer heel. And then the third position just becomes your rollover. So we can do this on the same leg. We have that same stance position, but now the back leg is really just rolled over onto the ball of the big toe. So the idea of the 4 corners still comes into play here. If I had 4 corners on the ground and I just brought my weight forward over this front leg, now I'm going to finish on the ball of the big toe, which would be basically the last part of the foot that you're in contact with before the foot comes off here. So our starting position here is 4 corners of the feet on the right, just light contact through the ball of the big toe on the left, hanging out here, doing some breath work, seeing how much support is necessary. Again, this foot doesn't take a lot of support, so we're not trying to put a lot of weight through it. It's really just like a little kickstand, and the more the weight feels like it's in the front leg, the better. All right, so those would be the 3 positions that we start with, and initially for a client, you may need to spend a lot of time with static positioning, focusing on breath work, focusing on balance, use as much support as necessary before we start making it a little bit more dynamic. Once we've identified the 3 positions and we feel like our clients have a good hold on them, then we can just start adding some dynamic transitions. So the first one to think about would be just stance to heel strike like we talked about. We can have just a fingertip touch or a whole hand touch, whatever somebody needs. Get the 4 corners of the stance leg. We're starting here. The swing foot is in line with this stance leg. And then we're just gonna tap the heel, bring it back. Tap the heel, bring it back. As the heel taps, you can really see if somebody's got a compensation. Do they want a side bend to get there? Or can they basically keep the position that they have on that right leg, just tap, bring it back. So it's a measurement of control. We're looking at trying to transition into this heel strike, bring it back, and then we can add the breath into this. So generally, if I'm going towards the outer edge of my foot, I'm expanding this left leg. I want to add an inhale, and then I'm going to exhale to bring it back. Inhale, expand, tap the outer heel, exhale to bring it back. Again, we're looking for all the same things we saw in the positional compensations would be toe gripping, and now in this case, we might start to see a little bit more of a listing side to side, some version of trying to get on this left leg because we're not feeling as comfortable just on the stance leg. And then you will see differences side to side quite a bit, is that you'll start to notice that people definitely have a bias towards being on one side more than the other. So that's going to be something that becomes pretty obvious, and it's good to note. The other thing when we're looking at any of these transitions, now the impact control idea comes into play quite a bit more, where if this heel is coming down and it slams down, well then that's a loss of impact control. Again, usually because there's not as much of a comfort being on one leg. So we want to make this as soft of a landing as possible with as minimal of a change on the stance leg as possible while we're just going from heel and bringing that back. Okay, and then if we get into that heel strike position, now the next transition we can focus on is this heel strike to roll over position. So this starts to teach us how to shift our weight from side to side. So I have the stance leg being the back leg right now, where I have my center of gravity over that leg. I've made that light outer heel contact. And now what I'm trying to do is just shift my weight forward. And now the stance leg or the center of gravity is over this left side. So the biggest compensation that you tend to see here is people don't want to bring their center of gravity forward. They don't feel comfortable doing that. So they just put the foot down and then the head comes forward, but they keep the hips back. So just noting that and getting someone comfortable with this idea is now we're bringing you all the way forward over this front foot, and these foot contacts become a really good cue again, where it's like now my four corners of my feet or my four quadrants are on the front leg, and then the only thing I have on the back foot is the ball of the big toes, the one quadrant there. And just shifting back, now when I shift back, I find the four corners on my back leg, I find the outer heel or one of the corners on my front leg, and then I shift forward, I have the four corners on my front leg, my weight is over the front leg, and I've rolled through the ball of the big toe on the back leg. And that shifting back and forth is the idea that we're looking for. How smooth can that be? Another compensation you'll see is you'll just sort of overshoot when you come forward. So there's, again, gripping, you lose the heel. But again, those contacts of the feet become so valuable here to get people to understand this idea of weight shifting and where they are in space. And then from this rollover position, we can then, again, bring it back. So now we shift back and right through heel strike, we just go right into rollover, which is a little bit more of a challenge, or sorry, right into stance, which is a little bit more of a challenge to our balance. So we start in this rollover position and we can rock back into stance. We can also do this forward, which again, will carry over to traveling forward with walking, where we're in rollover, we just pick the foot up, now we're in one-legged stance, we roll back to rollover, and then we're gonna rock ourselves all the way back into stance going backwards. So it's useful to practice this forward and backward, even though obviously when we walk, we'll be walking forward, just because this sort of ability to go back and forth just helps us appreciate that these are all just positions that we're transitioning through. And again, it helps to dictate out our balance or our stride length. So if we overstride, now it's going to be really, really hard to get ourselves back into the position that we want to be in. But it also can be part of the challenge and the progression that we look at is how well can we control our landings when we stride out. That'll dictate what somebody's ready for or what maybe someone's stride length should be if they're trying to mitigate ground contact through the ground. All right, so as we get into this rollover to stance, again, we're looking at balance. One of the biggest compensations you start to see as you bring this foot forward, again, people want to hinge, they want to bow forward, they don't feel so comfortable staying over this leg and feeling like they're able to keep that center of gravity over the leg. And the same thing when you come back, it's a little bit harder going back. You might feel like you lose your balance backwards. So we're always assessing balance with walking, and with a client, one of the things they notice right away is that everybody was walking all day long, but when you slow it down, there's quite a bit of balance that's involved in it. And as your balance improves, you can really see how it's very much integrated into a more efficient gait process. So I think about like balance training now, it's very unnecessary in my opinion to take people out of the movement that they need balance for. And the number one functional movement that someone's going to need balance for is walking. So you might as well train their balance within the gait cycle, within the thing that they need to be functional. And there's so many different ways to do that by just transitioning in and out of these positions. And then the final transition would be just a stance to stance rocking. So if we start in stance, I rock through, now I'm in stance on the other leg. I roll through heel strike, I come back to my stance here. So this is just stance to stance rocking. You can just see how people are at shifting their weight. Can they keep their foot contact? How's their balance? If that starts to become smoother, then we can start to transition things forward into an actual slow walking stride. So once we've gone through those dynamic transitions or the rocking from position to position, now we can actually start to travel forward and look at a slow walking pattern. And oftentimes you'll need to use some type of support with clients as you're starting to slow their gait down. But the idea here would be, okay, we've already identified all these positions. So we have our stance. Now we go to heel strike. We already assessed how does somebody move from stance to heel strike. All right, they can do that well. Now you're going to shift the body forward. The pillar of support comes over this front leg. You've attained rollover through the back foot. Now we just pick the foot up. Now we're in stance again, and we just keep moving forward. Heel strike, rollover, stance, heel strike, rollover, stance. All right, the smoother that gets, the more you have just identified somebody's got good control of their base of support, good control of their balance. It also becomes a great assessment of impact control, because if somebody can do this really well, they're not slamming into the ground. So this becomes just a sign that they're really in control of how they're landing, and it becomes one of the best things to just start to identify when you're working around ankle pain, knee pain, hip pain, is because a lot of times if you're getting pain with that type of walking or even up into the back, it's because there's a little bit too much loading into the ground. So this slow walking teaches balance, but it also teaches I'm not really going into the ground, I'm gliding forward. That's the idea. I'm trying to propel forward with as little contact into the ground as possible. And a lot of times, again, that's dictated by how somebody's striding out and how much they can control the shifting of their base of support one way, or forward and backward. I also like to take this backward if possible, as much as anyone can tolerate, because it again shows this idea of I'm really just moving back and forth through positions. So if I can do this well going backwards, then that tells me I haven't strided out too much. I'm in control of all of that, so that we really should be able to go forward, backward, and even eventually side to side. And I'm even bringing my pillar of support or my center of gravity over myself as I move forward. So if I can do that slowly, then when I do it fast, it's going to tell me that I'm not hitting into the ground, or I'm not going farther with my stride than I can control. Some people will have to make that a little bit easier for. So again, we'll use solid pillars when we're just working on the stance positions or even the rocking positions if that's what's necessary. But if we're moving forward, then we have things like canes. Even with some people who are using walkers, we can have them hold on to the walker and just focus on these slow steps and where they're landing, and can they bring their walker over the leg. So actually using this idea, this system of looking at positions and transitions, is a good way to teach someone how to use a walker, how to use a cane, how to use crutches, because there's going to be a way of slowing it down and getting a sense of how do I move my support with my body and not overstride, not get it out in front of myself, because that could be where danger lies or where people get unsafe. So in the clinic here, I usually use these walking sticks as much as possible. But again, this could be crutches, this could be 2 canes, 1 cane. But if you have to have somebody slow walking down, again, there's going to be balance issues. So it can be very useful to have these 2 walking sticks as something that you use. So now I'm going to just go through the same thing here, where I'm in stance, heel strike, shift forward into rollover, bring it up to stance, move forward. And at first, we don't have to give a lot of cues on how you're using these. We'll make the reciprocal motion, that'll come next. But just let them move the sticks however they feel they need to keep their balance. So obviously when they're on one leg here in stance, that's where the challenge to the balance is going to be the most. So they might have to put weight down through the sticks. As that's happening, a lot of times you'll start to see some compensations where, okay, I'm going to start leaning forward a little bit too much, hinging, losing my pillar, and you just guide that as much as is necessary. And we don't have to go fast here. That's one of the values of this type of treatment, is that you're starting to look at slowing things down. So if you notice that there's a loss of position, just slow it down, have them use a little bit more support, turn it into more of a static position as much as necessary, and then once they can gain that back, then you can start traveling forward again. Okay, so the sticks are just the most obvious way to travel forward. And then one of the things we could start looking at and building is then adding a little bit of opposite arm and leg swing, or some reciprocity into the movement. So with the sticks at first, it can be, as I'm in this heel strike position, the swing leg that's forward, I'm generally going to want the opposite arm forward, because as I do that, it'll start to allow for a little bit more rotation. And this rotation actually allows me to stride out a little bit more than I otherwise would if I was just straight on and, say, holding 2 suitcases at my side. I can add a little bit more turn, and that turn allows my stride to go out in front of me a bit more without hinging forward or losing this center of gravity over the backside. So left foot forward, right hand a little bit forward, and that's going to create this little twist. Then I'm going to come back to my rollover. The hands start to get a little bit more even, or the poles get a little bit more even here. When I'm in stance, I'm starting the process of turning. So then my left hand's a little bit in front of the right. And then once I get into this heel strike, I have the biggest amount of turn. So whether I'm using the sticks or not, practicing that idea and then pausing this, and this becomes its own position to train, where I have my heel strike. Now I'm going to really exaggerate how much turn I can get here. So my left hand will be forward, my right hand will be a little bit back, but my gaze is forward. So I get this sense of twisting through the middle, but my load is still over this left leg. I could lift my right heel to tell me that I'm in control of this position. I'm using the sticks as much as I need, but as little as I need, and then I can take some breaths here. So the inhale, I might focus on reaching into that outer heel, expanding through my middle. Exhale, maybe I'll twist a little bit, focus on my inner foot contacts because that's more of the idea of compressing down into the ground. Inhale, expand, reach, turn a little bit. Exhale, focus on driving through the stance leg. So generally, if we're using the breath, we talked about this in the breath control presentation, the inhale goes with more expansive movements. So the swing legs movements will be the more expansive movements here, especially when I'm going towards heel strike because I'm more to the outer edge of that foot. And then my exhale can focus more on down through the medial contacts or the inner contacts of the foot. So I can get the breath to really enhance that reciprocity or that reciprocal motion during these positions where I'm slowing down. If I'm moving with a little bit more speed, it can be inhale as the heel comes down, exhale as the inner contact come down while I'm rolling through, inhale to lift the leg, exhale, pause, feel the inner contacts of the foot, and then again, inhale as that outer heel comes through. And then I could pause again if I want to just feel those inner contacts, or I can start just moving forward a little bit more and, just have the breath match the movement a little bit more. So we can slow this down and connect the breath to it as much as we want, or we can just kind of give one cue. It might be inhale as the outer heel comes down, and then wait for that next outer heel contact, and that's when you're going to time the inhale. So to expand on this idea of reciprocity, the heel strike is really the best position to feel this in. So if we get into this heel strike position and we get this opposite arm and leg turn, this is really a good place to start working on breath, working on the idea of expansion versus compression here. So as I'm in this reaching position here, every time I breathe in, I want to think about contact through my outer heel, but I also want to think about the arm that's forward. I'm going to think about that chest wall on the front. So my right chest wall in this case, and then if I can even imagine that space between the shoulder blades more on the left side is moving back. So if I'm inflating my right lung, we can think about inflating the back of the left lung, and that's going to expand me through the chest while I'm reaching through my outer leg or my front leg into the outer heel. I'm going to be able to really optimize the expansion here. It helps me improve the turn. On the exhale, I'm not really changing this position, but if I can focus on getting a little heavier through my inner foot, through the ball of the foot and the inner heel, without completely dropping, because if I drop the midfoot down, I'm going to tend to lose my knee position. It's really just getting heavier through the ground, and then I can do a couple breath cycles here. So enhancing the reach, my left arm is reaching away from the right, my right chest wall is expanding, the back of the space between the shoulder blades on the left, that's expanding while I feel like I'm reaching through the outer heel of the left. Exhale, you'll feel a little twist in the belly, your obliques might get involved there, but you're getting heavier through those medial contacts. And then again, we can take that to the other side and do the same thing. And just really feeling where there's a restriction there, that can actually feel quite good. It's almost its own version of a spinal twist, but we're doing it in these positions of gait, which can then start to carry over to our slow walk where we get a little bit more of this obvious turn as we're landing that heel. We kind of land in that position that we just practiced. And then the breath can be something we always just pause and feel if we want to. Very much like you would do in a yoga practice where you're pausing in some type of asana where you're just holding a position, reaching, elongating, exhaling, feeling different contacts as you do that. It just enhances the position. So using these positions, slowing them down, again, it just makes the gait cycle become its own movement practice that you can really do a lot with. And a couple notes on when we think about reciprocal motion with gait, it does appear that the arms and legs are moving in an opposite direction, but in general, we're always moving forward. So the idea is not so much that we're moving in opposite directions, or that would actually make us not go anywhere, but it's really more that one side is delayed on another. So I think that's a useful thing to appreciate, because as we're starting to slow down, we're thinking like this leg is still trying to come forward, but as we turn, it helps us delay this side as much as possible. So when we walk a little bit faster, just having that sense of everything is moving forward, but we have to have one side be a little bit more delayed on the other. And usually the compensations that you see with gait is that everything just kind of comes forward. There's not as much of a delay. So this idea of keeping the center of gravity over itself and shifting the center of gravity is ultimately the essence of gait that we're trying to work on. So we often have to slow it down, but eventually the cue when we walk a little bit faster is something more like a quick and light, or somebody's pulling your hips forward, because the compensations that you'll tend to see will be that your body shifts side to side. Everything starts to come forward into some type of forward bend or forward lean, or there's like a stride where the head and shoulders are coming out in front, which creates a very heavy landing, because we're not actually shifting our weight or we're getting over our center of gravity as much. So this idea of delaying before we put a leg down, delaying before we put a leg down, that's what we're working on with these positions and transitions. If we're having clients that have a difficult time, say, shifting load more on one side than the other, one of the ways to improve that is to use some ramps or elevations, boxes, to offload one side or shift the weight away from another side. So if we say go downhill, generally, that's going to move my heels up, and that's going to put my foot into more of a supinated position. So that can be quite useful to just kind of think about it from a standpoint of, if I want to have a little bit more weight into this back leg, or I'm going to think about just trying to take a little bit of weight off of this front leg, then now I can have this leg be going on a downhill, just tapping the heel, bring it back. It also elevates the foot a little bit, which we can do with just some type of step. So any type of elevation here, but especially an elevation that's a little bit more downhill, that can actually help us keep a little bit more weight into this backside. The downhill actually becomes a lot more valuable when we start thinking about things like squatting, where we have to keep our weight back while we have both legs on here. So we probably won't use this as much in something like gait, but just the general idea is it'll bias us a little bit more towards external rotation or staying back, which we may need people to do. Sometimes, if you start noticing people are always falling forward when you put them in a one-legged stance, if you start with both legs downhill and you stand up, one of the cues you can have when you're downhill is to say, all right, well, this is pushing you forward, obviously. How much can you get back into your heel and get off of your toes? And it's another little balance drill, but it teaches people to get their weight back, and they're not going to fall over because they're starting in a downhill. So there's always that value of using a ramp to just teach people to shift weight, because you're biasing them in one direction, then they'll have the ability, hopefully, to go better in the direction you're not biasing them. All right, so if we look at the uphill, some of the value here would be, now I'm going to shift myself more back towards my heel. So it's another way to help to bias things backwards, but depends on what kind of people do well with, right? So in this case, I'm being pushed back, so that might be enough to say, okay, well, I'm not going to be forward anymore because the ramp is guiding me back. Sometimes this becomes a little bit too hard. If somebody's really not used to it, they're just going to keep falling backwards, and that's where you might need to use a little bit more of the downhill. But just by cueing the front of the foot uphill, now my focus is just more on my heels in contact with the ground, and then you can give a cue to say, can I keep the ball of the big toe, or can I keep the four corners of the foot down as much as possible? So that can help you with your stance position if somebody, again, is wanting to shift everything forward. And then something that is really useful, because a lot of times we're focusing on this first met head of staying down. You'll see a lot of times the rocking of the body weight is going to lift that. Even if you can get the heel down, it's the ball of the big toe doesn't want to stay down. So if you put a ramp just on maybe the second or third or the first or second med head, and you can keep the other med heads on the ground. Now I have this contact point to push into while I'm still able to keep the heel grounded, and then this becomes a nice drill. It makes it harder on the ankle, but that's part of what we're working on, is building the strength to say, okay, I want to press into that wedge. I want to still keep my heel anchored, and then what strength am I building as I'm doing that? So sometimes these things become a way to make it a little easier. Sometimes they add a little resistance, or they build strength in the position if you're starting to see somebody's having a hard time keeping the contact points that you're asking of them. So something a little bit easier to get a sense of just shifting weight is if I just elevate the front foot, now that should shift my weight back. All right, so sometimes people will lean into this, they'll need a little bit of cue to say, okay, push back a little bit, but a lot of times just the higher I get this leg, the more it has to shift somebody back into their back leg. So not exactly in my stance position here, but if I just need somebody to get better at shifting the gravity over that leg, then I want that front foot to be elevated as much as possible. And then this can carry over to things like when we get into lunging, where now it's a more of a front foot elevated lunge, where that should shift me back more in order for me to get all the way down, versus the opposite. When I elevate this back leg, now I'm in sort of a rollover, but an elevated rollover. That should shift my weight a little bit more to the front leg, and then it carries over to things like a rear foot elevated split squat, where that should shift my weight forward if that's the goal. So just having that idea of where do I want to shift weight? I can use ramps, I can use boxes, so I don't have to be cueing people like crazy, but just use some tools, use some constraints to guide them into that position. As a summary, the practice progressions that we can go through is that we just start with static positionings with as much support as somebody needs, and then we slowly start to turn down the amount of support they need. And then we go through controlled transitions. So we just identify two positions and we try to flow or rock between those two positions, see how smooth we can get people to move through that, see how much support they need, see if they can start letting up on some of that support. And then we can add some reciprocal exaggeration, right? So as we slow things down, we can really exaggerate how much reciprocity would be necessary when somebody's walking, so that they get a sense of when they're moving at a little bit more of a normal speed, that they still have that reciprocity. They can also identify what the purpose of it is, because most clients have no idea. They walk all day long. They don't understand necessarily why there would be a purpose of adding some rotation or reciprocal motion. And when you're starting to lose that, what that can do to you, and how you can start to feel like certain things are getting limited or getting tighter because they're not getting the movement variability that they normally would through a nice reciprocal gait pattern. So as we slow it down, we exaggerate it, we can start to show people that, oh, you get the spinal twist, you get actually some movement through your center there, and it can actually feel like a very good stretch or some type of recovery practice as we slow it down. The other thing you can start to do is, as you're starting to move slower, you can start to add some head movements and look around. So one of the ways you can look at the value of gait and gaze is when you're walking around the environment, you should be able to span and look around. You shouldn't have to have your eyes focused down. But when we start to slow things down, it might be very difficult for somebody to be looking around, because we're already challenging their balance by slowing it down. So as we start to progress, it might be hold your stance position, look at something around the room. Can you maintain this position, again, with or without support? And then even with slow walking, as I'm starting to go through these different positions, try to add some cues for input, looking around the room, and see how the balance is able to be maintained as these things are added into the mix. And then it would be the same thing as we add more of a normal gait speed, quick and light, walking a bit faster. Can they add some gaze changes? Can you look around the room and still feel like you don't get dizzy, you don't lose your balance, you don't lose your stride, you don't lose your impact control? One of the things we haven't really looked at yet is just how do we start to shift from going from a more controlled, really like a slower idea of moving, to actually adding like a more normal speed. So a lot of times that becomes some cues are just taken away. So if we have this idea of full foot contact when we're on our stance position. We find the outer heel when we're in heel strike. We find the ball of the big toe when we're in rollover. It might just be focusing on one contact would be feel the rollover. Feel like you're coming off the back foot. Might just be focused on, okay, I only want you to focus on the outer heel on the left side every time you step. It could be outer heel, right arm. So you just start to take some of the cues away and just have people focus on different cues. One of my favorites is just say quick and light. I just want you to move forward quick and light, don't make a lot of noise. Let's see what that looks like. And then you start adding some different things in. Quick and light, let your arms go a little bit, see if they flow. All right, so the cues start to be pulled away with the goal being that now we're propelling forward at a more normal rate. But by slowing that gait down, hopefully the stride has changed because we're seeing the value of having the stride be always in a manner that holds that pillar of support over yourself, or the center of gravity over your pillar of support. So as we start adding load to the gait cycle, it will also give us the opportunity to bias one side over the other. So let's say we want to compress one side and sort of let the other side expand a little bit more. We just do a single-sided farmer carry or suitcase carry. And now this will sort of naturally limit the arm swing. And the heavier this weight is, the more it's going to limit my arm swing. So this side will be generally a little bit more compressed. And then as I walk, I can just get a sense of my left side is more of the swing side. The right side is going to be a little heavier through the stance leg. And then I would just change that. So you can get a sense of one side's a little bit harder to find a rhythm in. For me, I can feel it's my left side. And that's not uncommon. So if there is a side that somebody biases away from, then a lot of times adding the kettlebell onto that side can give them a little bit more feeling of heaviness through that side. And sometimes it's vice versa. Depending on how heavy the weight is, it might feel like you need to go to the opposite side to counter, so it actually gives you a little bit more feeling of balance to go away from the side where the heavy weight is. So that could be actually quite useful to start to get people to shift their weight a little bit better, because you give them a single-sided bell and they have to either shift towards that side, go with the bell, or go away from it. Finally, when we have all those positions down, we can just add some complexity to it, add some range of motion to the position. So one of the assessments I like to do, which eventually turns into a nice warm-up, is take the slow walking pattern and add a step down to it, add a walking lunge, and then add something called like a split hinge, or where we're just taking our body forward into what looks like the world's greatest, but traveling forward with all that. So if we have this idea of just moving our body over our center of gravity, we start with the slow walking, we do a couple steps there, heel strike, roll over. I can make this as reciprocal as I need. I can add like a little bit of a leg lift into a march to give me a sense of, okay, I'm really controlling this. But that's also increasing my hip extension here by flexing this opposite hip. And now I'm going to take this into a step down, where it's basically like the beginning of a one-legged stance. I drop down as if I was stepping down a step. I drop into my heel. So by doing that, it allows me to stride out a little bit more without losing my center of gravity. So I'm still over this left side. I'm still lightly touching the right side. Now I have to step a little bit more forward, load this leg into a little bit more of a knee bend as I bring this through, and I step down as I walk through there. Okay, and I can take all of this backwards too, because I'm demonstrating that I can get over this leg before I pick this up here. So this is an assessment here. If somebody's got some knee issues that they're working on, they say they have a hard time going downstairs, we can see what's the stride that they can do and still get themselves over a leg before they pull themselves back here. So if I stride out too much, I'm not going to be able to get that foot down, so I have to bring that in. It shows me what I'm ready for. Okay, I could load through this leg in more of a knee bent or step down position. So that becomes the second progression, and then I can flow right into a walking lunge. So I'm here, I'm going to step forward, now I'm going to drop down. So now my stance leg is really through this stance knee, where my knee is in line with my hip, shoulder, and head. So I can pick this foot up because I have all my weight through here, and then I'm bringing myself back up. Now I'm in stance again, balance check, and then I come forward, outer heel, drop down into this stance knee, stand back up, I'm in stance. Okay, a little harder to go backwards, but you could assess that as well. And then the final piece here would be to take this forward even farther with my stride, but now I'm going to bring my body forward. And now the stance idea is more of a diagonal from heel through my hip, through my shoulder. I'm heavy through this front leg because I had to bring all my body weight forward, but I still come up into stance and I bring everything forward and I hinge now. So I call this a split hinge because I'm in a split position, but I'm hinged over the front leg, driving down through this front foot, and I find my stance again. So if those are well controlled, then you have a pretty good idea that all of the things that are necessary for the gait cycle are also going to be at least better controlled than what they were. So hopefully that was useful. This is going to be the first of going through pretty much any movement that we would see in the clinic that somebody complains of or having pain or something they want to work on getting stronger. So to me, gait is such a foundation, and you can see already we're starting to look at things like lunges, and it'll even carry into things like squatting and split squatting, and seeing how as we shift weight, as we keep our center of gravity where we want it, that's going to carry over to pretty much every movement that we talk about within the movement continuum.